Hello, everybody. Welcome to Snakes Are Everything. If this is your first time or you're just not that familiar with me or the organization, I'm Melissa. I'm the executive director, and along with Jeff Smith, the co-founder of Advocates for Snake Preservation. And for those unfamiliar with ASP, we're a 501c3 charity dedicated to changing how people view and treat snakes. So we do this by providing solutions to human-snake conflicts that sometimes end badly for people, but often prove fatal for snakes. And we tell stories about wild snake behavior to counter prevailing myths and make snakes more familiar and less scary. So today on Snakes Are Everything, I'm excited to introduce Dr. Andrew Hoffman, whose talk is titled Snakes Are Feared. And Andrew Hoffman has a PhD from the Ohio State University on timber rattlesnakes. And what I think was really interesting about his project was that he actually included this part of conservation that is often left out of conservation biology. We tend to focus on the biology side of things and leave out the people side of things. And that's something that he actually included in his dissertation. He has gone on to start on a postdoc also at the Ohio State University, and that is where he is working now. He has experience as an interpretive naturalist, and that includes doing some targeted outreach program with landowners and foresters that lived and worked in the area where he did his work on timber rattlesnakes. How I became familiar with Andrew was actually not through any of that. It was because he is the creator and host of the YouTube channel Life Underfoot. And I don't encourage you to do this right now, but after we're done, I think you'll definitely want to check out this channel because, and this is a lot of what he's going to talk about today, so I don't want to spoil too much, but what really drew me to this was that I think it strikes a good balance between being like exciting and grabbing the attention that you need to do on YouTube, while presenting scientifically accurate information about wildlife. And when he's talking about snakes, about doing that in a kind way, which is unfortunately like pretty rare for videos about snakes on YouTube and in other places. And I don't want to say anything more about that because I don't want to spoil his talk. So just as a reminder before I hand it off to Andrew, this is live. We're recording it for posting on YouTube later, and we definitely encourage you to ask questions, and we'll take those at the end. And you can just put your questions in the chat, and we'll get them at the end. Or if you'd rather at the end, turn on your camera and microphone and ask your questions live, you're welcome to do that too at the end. But during his presentation, if you could keep your cameras off and your microphone's muted, that will make for a better presentation for everyone else, so we'll be able to see what's going on. Andrew, if you want to switch to screen sharing and get started.
All right, thank you so much. Let's see if I can get effectively switched over here. Am I? Let's see. Oh, there we go. Try again. Okay, that should work then. Yes, there we go. Thank you for that introduction, Melissa. I have been working with snakes now for a while. I guess most of my career I've been doing field research with reptiles and amphibians. And I don't know if my picture is showing up there while I'm talking. I'm doing kind of a dual screen thing here. But I've been involved in field research mostly with spatial ecology of reptiles and amphibians during my undergrad, my master's, and more recently my PhD. And I've specifically worked with snakes during my PhD and now my postdoc. But as Melissa said, I got an interest in some social science during my PhD and got to do a little bit of that with timber rattlesnakes. And really, I think COVID was the real impetus for this. I got more involved in distance outreach and education, which ended up being YouTube primarily for me. And fortunately, I have a couple great colleagues that I work with on this channel, Zach Trulock and John Buffington, and we actually all kind of got together and met working with timber rattlesnakes a few years ago. So we made a good team and we decided to go in together on this YouTube endeavor, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And I'll first preface everything with this whole series has touched on a lot of what I'm going to be talking about with the fear of snakes today. And some of the previous speakers have done a great job at delving in deep to different elements of this. So I'm going to mostly give a brief background on fear of snakes just as a theoretical thing, and try to spend more of my time talking about how this manifests itself in media, especially social media, and giving folks that want to get involved in social media some tools to get started if they want to try to grow a presence in some element of social media, make videos especially that feature snakes in a more positive light. So with that, first off, I think it's worth talking about fear of snakes. You know, this is an uphill battle we're fighting. It is tough because it can both be very intense. At its most intense, we call it ophidiophobia, which is, as most phobias, a very specific and intense, sometimes irrational fear of a thing that is pretty disruptive to an individual's life, or can be. I've known people who couldn't walk into a room if they knew a snake was in there somewhere, even if they didn't see it. Also known people who couldn't open books that had pictures of snakes in them. So that's the intensity with which this fear can manifest. We also know to some extent that there is something deeply innate to maybe not the fear itself, but the recognition of snakes. And as I mentioned, the previous speakers on this point especially have gone into great detail and done a good job of weighing the evidence that's out there. But my take on it, as I think most others, is that there does seem to be a predisposition to even, you know, as a very young age, recognize a snake, pick it out against a complex background, and know that that's something to pay attention to. But it may be our environment that then tells us it's something to be feared. So this is the scale we're working against. Now, of course, not everybody who has negative perceptions of snakes is intensely afraid of them, and it may not take an intense fear to have conservation consequences for snakes. And so to give kind of a more localized perspective, I've done all my work in Ohio recently. We did our social science component of our work with timber rattlesnakes in Ohio. It involved sending out basically a link to an online survey through a sampling firm, Qualtrics, and trying to get as many different people to respond to this online survey across kind of a random cross section of Ohio residents, and basically tell us what they thought about snakes, answer a whole series of questions about snakes that we can then feed into models to try to predict what makes them feel the way they do about snakes. And specifically, I was working with somebody who had done a lot of work with tolerance, the idea of how much are people willing to put up with an animal that poses some kind of risk to them living near them. This person had worked with, Jeremy Bruscotter had worked with tolerance in carnivores out west, like bear and wolves. We wanted to see if we could apply those models to snakes. It turns out the models weren't a perfect fit, at least as we approached it here, to understanding tolerance in snakes, but we did get some interesting responses to some of these questions and some interesting results. And the only thing I really want to touch on here, I'm happy to answer more questions about this later, but just as a primer for understanding what kind of negative perceptions may be out there about snakes, we did ask the question, we just asked people to indicate whether they liked or disliked a whole list of animals. And there were more than this in the survey, but I didn't want to clutter the figure more than it already is. So here's a decent sample that spans animals that people really like and animals that people really don't like. The figure next to that list of animals represents, each bar is representative of one of those animals. Now, I haven't linked them up yet. I kind of want to give you a minute to see if you can guess where the various animals fell out on being intensely disliked or being liked a lot by our 447 random sample of Ohio adults. And you can kind of see what each color on these bars means. That's just the percentage of respondents that responded a particular way. More red means more disliking of that animal, more blue means more liking. We're, of course, interested in snakes. We put rattlesnakes, black rat snakes, and king snakes on the questionnaire. And we sort of expected different responses here because Rattlesnakes, obviously, everyone knows that's a venomous animal. People have a reaction to that. Black rat snakes, most people in Ohio who are familiar with them know that they're harmless. In king snakes, if people have an association with that here in Ohio, it's usually that they're sort of told this is a snake that will eat other snakes, so they might even like king snakes. But the reality was snakes predictably fell out low on this scale, a lot of disliking here, but they all were kind of the same. The farthest left bar there is the rattlesnake bar, so it's slightly more strong dislikes than the other two, which are basically the same, but really not as much variation between these different kinds of snakes. It seems like for just whether people like them or not, maybe a snake's a snake. But snakes were just above spiders, rats, wasps, and mosquitoes, and below crows, bear, cats, deer, dogs, and turtles. So for all of you turtle researchers out there, in terms of having to convince people that turtles are nice and that they should like them, seems like you're in a good shape for that. People really like turtles. They're the only one that didn't have any strong dislikes or dislikes on the whole survey. But snakes, of course, did. In fact, about 30% or more said they strongly disliked snakes. And if this is indeed a representative sample of Ohio residents, which we hope it is, that means that about a third of the people in Ohio really don't like snakes, which if you have been working with snakes, that may not be terribly surprising. But maybe a little more disheartening is that over half of the respondents generally, to some extent, disliked snakes, somewhat disliked them, too strongly disliked them. And that is that's not great if you're trying to convince people there's a reason to conserve something and put money and effort towards conserving it. And it's worth noting just how disproportionate this fear of snakes is here in the United States, especially. So there are parts of the world where snake bites are relatively frequent. There are very, very venomous snakes that people come into contact with frequently, and it's a real prominent public health concern. But for most of the United States, snake bites are incredibly rare. In the places where they happen more often, they're still much rarer than a lot of other things that we don't tend to think about that often. In fact, on average, about 5 people die in the US every year from a venomous snake bite, which any death is tragic. But when you scale this against other things that we tend to think of as really rare, unlikely ways in which people are sometimes killed, you have lightning strikes, which you're about 4 times more likely to die from that than snake bite in the US. Over 4 times more likely to die from a dog attack, which dog attacks are much more common generally than snake bites. And you're much, much more likely to die from a lawnmower accident than you are from a venomous snake bite. I sort of purposefully snuck this one in because I have an axe to grind against mowed lawns. Mowed lawns are not good for the environment. They mostly are propagating non-native species and not many things can live in them. And turns out it's dangerous to maintain your lawn. And really the people that are injured in lawnmower accidents are disproportionately children. So not something we tend to think of as being a prominent danger and something that we do fairly frequently, but it is, at least compared to snake bite. And then at 185 deaths per year, we have collisions with animals, which may not be as surprising because we do hear quite a bit in certain areas of the country, at least about how often people end up hitting deers. But if you remember back to the previous slide, dogs and deer were at the top of things that people really liked, and yet they are far more dangerous statistically than venomous snakes, than snakes generally. And there are pretty big swaths of the United States, including where I'm stationed here in central Ohio, where there are no longer any venomous snakes, and in some areas where there really probably weren't ever venomous snakes when you get far enough north. So this is a fear that's very intense. The negative perception of snakes is very widespread. And generally speaking, here in the US, this is a fear that is not really something that deserves that much attention and concern for most people. And it has real conservation consequences. And I think a great example of this is the scrapped plan to introduce rattlesnakes to this island and on a reservoir in Massachusetts in an attempt to sort of help secure their population in that state. This was, to my knowledge, a relatively remote off-limits island that people weren't hanging out on, people weren't living on, and yet there were enough fears from people who lived, nearby on the shoreline that snakes might swim from that island and make it, quite a distance to wherever they live, that the whole project had to be scrapped. So, I mean, to me, if we can't introduce venomous snakes to secure their population into areas that are this remote and off limits, it seems very difficult to envision how we could ever use reintroduction or translocation as a conservation tool to recover some of these species in areas where it's not this off limits. And I do think that fear of snakes plays a big role into why these kind of things are hard to do. And it's not hard to see how this fear is perpetuated in Hollywood, especially. But there's been lots of ways that the fear of snakes has been perpetuated long before movies in Hollywood. But this sort of amplifies it because a lot of people go to see these big blockbuster movies, and yes, these are kind of purposefully playing on tropes, and some of these are kind of tongue in cheek. But at the same time, it has to kind of form a bit of a reinforcement loop in someone's brain if they're already scared of snakes. That, oh wow, that's kind of a worst case scenario. It's probably not realistic, but maybe it's kind of believable. And this really spans my whole upbringing. I had Anaconda when I was in elementary school was the sort of prominent giant terrifying snake movie, and Snakes on a Plane was kind of the funny but still some people were very scared of it movie when I was in college. And then Mud came out around the time I was finishing graduate school, which was a more serious film, but a kind of center point of this film revolved around this sort of muddy hole that Cottonmouth lived in, like some kind of monster's den, that the protagonist had some bad experience as a kid, and that the kid in the movie then also has this obviously bad experience. And if you know your snakes, you can look at that picture and see you've got what look like racers and king snakes, and not so much anything particularly dangerous. But this I would term overt exploitation. This is exploiting the fear of snakes to sort of drum up excitement and emotions over a movie. And it's done purposefully, it's done knowingly, knowing that it's way over the top for the most part. And so I think we recognize this, and anybody who knows anything about snakes tends to accept that this is, it is what it is. But I think maybe what we need to spend a little more time scrutinizing is what I would call covert exploitation, something that is either unintentional or better hidden than these really obviously over the top portrayals of snakes that we see in Hollywood. And I think that the tragic thing is that sometimes this is done by very well meaning people who are snake enthusiasts themselves that just want to educate people and help people feel really good about snakes, but in the end up probably doing more harm than good, at least sometimes. Now, this is complicated. I don't know of any real attempt to quantify, or how you would even quantify the good versus the bad that the prominent wildlife TV host personalities have done. They have huge platforms. Many people have seen what they're doing. I grew up kind of under the shadow of Steve Irwin. Steve Irwin was an inspiration for me in my career, and almost a lot of people my age say similar things about Steve Irwin. But as I've gotten older, I've kind of had to come to grips with all the complexities therein and the problematic things that were part of that legacy. And the legacy of Steve Irwin is not just that, but it's also all the people that have come after that now want to replicate the success and the style that he had. And I think it's a useful place to start because it's very easy to look at these wildlife hosts and get concerned about how they're handling the animals, the risks they're taking. Those are the really obvious problems. But I think there's a more sort of subtle problem here that is really worth talking about. And when I get upset with TV hosts, with YouTube personalities doing videos about snakes, it's almost never about how they're interacting with animals, but instead what they're saying. Because people really internalize the terminology you use, even if you don't think too hard about it. And so what I did here, and I've done this a little bit just in my sort of quest to better acquaint myself with what success looks like on YouTube, what kind of videos seem to do well, and how to characterize them. I have gone through and basically mined a lot of videos about snakes that are very prominent, and looked at the adjectives used within the video to describe the snakes. In being a visual person, a way I like to represent this is with word clouds. So here we have about 20 minutes of video from kind of a best of Steve Irwin with venomous deadly snakes, and about 20 minutes from the Brave Wilderness channel, Coyote Peterson being kind of the one who has a similarly large platform now, but there's a lot of other people like him on YouTube that have very similar methodology to their videos. So about 20 minutes from both, two different videos for the Brave Wilderness channel because the videos weren't as long. But here's what we get for the word cloud from the Brave Wilderness channel. And I would say this is similar to what I see from a lot of modern YouTube channels that focus on snakes and have this kind of style. You see, now in this case, there's not a whole lot of terms used repeatedly. The bigger words indicate a word that was used more often. But you can still get a pretty good feel for all of the different kinds of descriptions levied at snakes in this video, in these videos. And it's not a particularly good picture if you're trying to convince people snakes are a wonderful, amazing, cool thing and not a dangerous thing to be scared of. In fact, you can pretty quickly pick out a lot of pretty negative words that are used here alongside mostly kind of sterile or neutral words that are just purely descriptive, like nocturnal, semi-aquatic, unique. These aren't really giving you any real emotion that's positive about snakes. They're just describing. But some of these negative ones are giving you really negative emotions about snakes, especially something anthropomorphic like outlaw. A snake can't be an outlaw because snakes don't have laws. They don't have civilization. they're they're unable to be an outlaw or criminal. They don't break laws that they don't have. So I think this is a useful point to talk about anthropomorphism, which is this idea that it's very bad to give human characteristics to non-humans. But I think that sort of cuts both ways, because in this instance, I agree this is a problematic instance of anthropomorphism. You're using a loaded term related to sort of cultural, civilization related things that snakes have no bearing on. And I think there are instances, however, where anthropomorphism can be useful, because anthropomorphism is not wrongly giving snakes characteristics that humans have. It's giving snakes correctly the complexity that they deserve as a living, thinking creature with goals and ways of interacting with the environment. There's a great TED talk by Carl Safina, who does a lot of his work with sort of cognition and the minds of animals. And he's a great speaker talking about this stuff. But he says something along the lines of, we have inherited brains. We share this sort of evolutionary legacy of this brain, of this mind. And given that any individual can only know what's actually going on and they're perceiving in their own mind, we assume that other humans around us have similar thoughts and have similar inclinations. We can sort of view how the mind works and reacts to things, and it sort of confirms it. So then why do we change that entirely when we step slightly outside of the human species? Everything else has a lot of similarities in their brain, may not be as complex in some areas, but assuming automatically that anything we personally deem to be too special, that nothing else could possibly have it, is pretty non-scientific. So I think sometimes anthropomorphism is just giving other animals their due for how intelligent they are. And I credit Steve Irwin, if there's one thing I credit him with, it's with using good, positive anthropomorphic language. And it's not always anthropomorphic, but it's at least emotional and interesting, and it puts these animals in a different light. And for all the problems with how he approached and handled and the risks he took, he did do a pretty good job of introducing a lot of new dialogue to talk about these animals, and maybe not entirely new, but certainly the first time it had gotten this big a public stage for talking about crocodiles and snakes as being beautiful and gorgeous and glorious and cute. And even when he uses negative terminology, it's often in a way that downplays the sort of meanness of the animal. Because instead of using terms like mean, he may say naughty or a little grumpy instead of aggressive. Now, he's not perfect. He does say aggressive. He says dangerous. He uses all those terms, and it's played up in the videos to some extent. But I do think it's worth looking at Steve Irwin's dialogue and language use as a step forward in getting to a better place with how we not only perceive snakes, but other animals that we generally think of as dangerous or stupid or simple. That they're more complex, they're potentially beautiful, and they're individuals, beings with personalities. And so I think you've got to give Steve Irwin some credit for that. But what I hate to see is that there's a whole generation now of people who want to be Steve Irwin. I was one of them. And instead of replicating that component, the language that he used, they mostly replicate the sensational behavior and interactions with animals. So I think language really matters when we're doing outreach and education. And if you want to replicate something that was successful that Steve Irwin did, that the Crocodile Hunter did, replicate a lot of that language and that was a change and move forward with that. I think it's time to change the way we interact with animals on the screen if we do it at all. So, conclusion to all this is that yes, people that currently have big platforms absolutely should work towards improving the language that they use, being more mindful of the kind of the ideas they're putting out there, and trying to avoid some of sort of feeding into the negative perceptions of snakes that are already out there. But also, I encourage people that are interested in snakes, interested in getting more people to feel this way about them and see them for what they are, to pick up your phone, pick up whatever, and start building your own platform on YouTube. Start raising your own voices. As you may have realized from the pictures I've shown you, there's not been a lot of diversity in the most prominent voices for snakes, especially in the past. So we need diverse voices, and we need voices that are speaking sort of a different story, and using innovative techniques to get people to think more about the animal and less about how cool the person is that's messing with this potentially dangerous animal. So this is kind of going to be a short guide to how to use social media, and hopefully it's useful to people. My intention with this is that folks who see this and want to get involved in YouTube, Instagram, TikTok can have some tools at their disposal to take their interest and their knowledge about the resource, the wildlife, the animals, and be able to apply it now, having some tools to navigate the social media landscape. And I've done a little bit on all of these platforms. Our Life Underfoot channel started on YouTube. We've also have a Facebook page. We really don't do much with it. We do more with our Instagram and TikTok. I had some experience with Twitter. I actually ran a Twitter account called Timber Tweets, where we tweeted about the day in and day out lives of the timber rattlesnakes we were tracking in the field. But I just don't really like Twitter. I think it's great for some things, but it's not really what I want to do. So I'm not going to talk too much about it today. And I'm also not going to talk too much about Facebook, even though, as you could see from these numbers, it did have the largest monthly user base. It's still kind of the social media giant. I really want to focus on these more visual media oriented platforms that are almost purely video, photo content related. And YouTube especially, that's where I've spent most of my time. And of these three, YouTube's the hardest to break into. There's no doubt about this. YouTube has the biggest user base of these three, and it is the hardest one to grow on. But it sometimes results in people who have the biggest platforms and then even make the leap to TV and movies and whatever else. It's a very big platform if you can get people to watch the videos you post. And if you go into YouTube and you search snakes, you're going to see something like this. You're going to see videos that are sensational. You're going to see videos of giant snakes killing things, videos of sensational snake encounters, deadly venomous snakes with our friend Steve Irwin there again, and more videos about sensational snake encounters. We can kind of put all these in these three categories, but the reality is these have a lot of overlap. They're largely very similar. Sensationalism, over the top, danger. That's what most of the prominent snake videos you're going to find on YouTube are. And I think both for the purpose of, if you want to use YouTube and just understanding the problem, it's important to notice what makes these videos do so well. And it starts right here, the thumbnail and title. In fact, a lot of people who have built a big platform on YouTube recommend that people who want to do that, want to be on YouTube, spend more time on the thumbnail and the planning and the title than they do filming. Really, it's so important to get this part right, because this is your marketing. This is what people see, and if they don't click it, your video doesn't get watched. So here what we see that makes these successful are kind of low-hanging fruit. We've got misleading, sensationalized thumbnails, which we really don't want to do if we want to give the right image of snakes. We have some name recognition, which probably most of us don't have the luxury of having the name recognition to immediately garner an audience that's searching for us or our organization. And we also have a degree of what I'd almost call emotional manipulation. And I think, I don't want to say that's something we can use, but I think we can use a similar tactic that's a little more honest that can be equally as effective. And what I mean by emotional manipulation is someone sees this thumbnail and thinks, oh my gosh, this little girl is going to be attacked by that horrible snake, if they're someone that fears snakes, and that makes them want to click to see what happens. A lot of people have a morbid curiosity about things, and it's very much leaned into with these thumbnails. And these are not accidental thumbnails. These thumbnails and titles were carefully crafted, probably by people who were paid or at least have lots of experience doing it. And I want to break down kind of the anatomy of a YouTube thumbnail and title so that folks can have a better idea of maybe how to approach making their own YouTube thumbnails and titles. And first, we have the thumbnail. That's this small picture. And the size of this picture is something incredibly important to keep in mind, because right now, probably whatever you're seeing, if you're not on your phone screen at least, is larger than you're ever going to see an actual thumbnail. They are going to be very small when people are scrolling through them and making decisions about what to click. So the fewer elements, the simpler, the more interpretable it is, the more luck you're going to have with people actually knowing what your thumbnail is about and being interested in it. And really, the goal is to stand out. If we're on YouTube and searching for snake videos and we're looking through all the different options we have, you might see that this video stands out, at least in the crowd next to it, because the color scheme is different. There's less elements in it. So your eyes are just naturally going to be drawn to it very quickly. And that's good. the simpler and more straightforward your thumbnail can be to be effective, it's going to be more powerful. So you want it to stand out. So even looking at just sort of the color tones used, if you are trying to post a turtle video or a snake video, and you search for turtle and snake videos and you see there's kind of a particular trend that a lot of them have reds and yellows, or maybe you have a thumbnail that has more blues in it, it'll stand out. Simple things even like that can really help. It should be visible, clear. So just keep in mind scaling. Always create a thumbnail, then scale it down to as small as you're going to see it on your phone to make sure it's still interpretable. And it should elicit curiosity. In effect, the thumbnail is a value proposition. This whole package is a value proposition that if you click this video, your interest that's been piqued will be satisfied with something really cool. And in this case, we have a title that is backing up that interest, which is what a good title should do. This is, of course, all sensational, but you can still do this without the sensationalism, the value proposition, and the title that backs up that proposition of interest. The title should clarify and complement the thumbnail. So in this case, you see that, you think, oh, what's going to happen? Is that snake going to attack her? And then you see the title, which says, you really shouldn't watch this. And that's, of course, a really good psychological trick to get someone to do something, to say, oh, this is, you couldn't handle it. It's too intense. People have got to see what that means. And then also, just from a practical standpoint, keep the title short. The shorter you can make the title to deliver the message, the better. Under 70 characters will ensure that it's mostly going to always be seen in full by all different search engines. So a little bit of SEO involved here. You do have a description you can write when you make a YouTube video, but you don't really need to spend as much time worrying about this. It should add some detail and clarity and still preserve a little bit of the interest you piqued with the thumbnail and title, but it doesn't have to be extensive. And in fact, the main part of your description should be kept under 200 characters so that it doesn't get cut off by search engines. But those are just a few practical tips for making a successful thumbnail and title. And I can say, breaking apart this video, which has 1 million views, that seems to have what I would say a very well put together thumbnail. As I was doing this for this presentation, I then looked back to our most successful snake video we've had, and it was remarkable to me how similar the thumbnails are. We have a person on a road about to interact with a large snake. Ours wasn't doctored in any way, but it still has this simplicity, this proposition that something's about to happen here. I want to see what it is. Now, what we tried to do is a little bit of a bait and switch, which I think I mentioned earlier. It can be a little bit of a dangerous line to toe. We have the title, Is the Black Rat Snake Aggressive? A lot of people think snakes are aggressive, which they aren't. They don't attack people. They don't go out of their way to do anything to people. But the goal here was to draw people in with this idea that, are you afraid of this? Learn more about it here, and then turn the message around and say, actually, look how calm this thing is. I'm moving multiple snakes off the road as they're trying to cross roads today. None of them are biting. None of them are reacting. If I'm calm with them and I move them on their way, they're fine. And I think generally that was a good message, but I still sort of question if we were leaning a little too hard on the bait here, on trying to bait people in with their fear of snakes. So it's a really hard line to toe. I mean, this video reached about 250,000 people. It's our biggest video on our YouTube channel. And so that method was successful. And we do feel like we've reached people with a good message, but we still really try to dissect all of the messaging in each one of our videos and see if we're doing any harm. Now, I want to touch briefly on the algorithm. A lot of people talk about the YouTube algorithm, Instagram algorithm. It's a word that gets tossed around a lot, almost to the point to where it feels like it doesn't mean anything, just sort of a mysterious thing that each of these social media platforms has that usually is talked about in a negative context. But really, an algorithm is just a really complex mathematic formula that's made to do something, to complete some kind of task or with some kind of goal in mind. And in this case, the YouTube algorithm and most social media algorithms, their goal is to keep people on the platform as long as possible by learning about the videos and the users who are watching the videos, and then connecting the content that the user likes to watch with content that is created that is like the things that the user likes to watch. So it's pretty simple, pretty straightforward. It's in some ways streamlining the connection between the user and the content, but in other ways, it's often sort of incidentally or purposefully pushing content that's a little extreme, because we do tend to naturally be drawn to some of the extremes of our interests. And this is a problem that's led to a lot of people going down more extreme roads and seeing more extreme content. But I think it's first worth dispelling the creator-focused misconception behind this, which is I upload a YouTube video to the mysterious powers that be in YouTube, and they decide, thumbs up, video gets seen by people. No, it doesn't. Nobody gets to see it. But there's not really anybody actively making decisions or gatekeeping here. There's a mathematic formula that is trying to streamline things. And really, if you know how it works, you can kind of cater the way you build content to reach people. But the problem is, some of that involves sensationalization if you really want to reach the most people. The reality, the user-focused reality of how this algorithm works is a user logs into YouTube. YouTube has no history, no information about this user, so it gives them a diverse array of popular videos. That user finds and clicks on a car repair video. So now YouTube has logged every single second of that video. It's detailed it. It uses Google Brain, which is an AI that can go through videos and categorize every image, everything said, every word on the screen into a category, and then effectively come up with some idea of what this video is mostly about. So it doesn't really matter what you say it's about in your title or description. The Google Brain knows what the video is about. And then it looks at every little bit of the user's browsing history, everything they've ever clicked, exactly how long they've watched every video, when they stopped using YouTube in a session. So they monitor watch sessions. So if you watch 3 videos in a row, that's a more positive feedback loop for YouTube than if you watch one and leave. So if your videos trigger kind of a YouTube binging session, that's a really big positive sign. And that's part of how this whole thing works. So next time, a smarter YouTube algorithm that knows this user decides to suggest mostly videos on car repair, automobiles, travel, anything that it thinks might be tangential to this user's interest. And the result is the user stays on longer and watches more of these recommended videos because they're more catered to the user. And of course, the problem is that's how you can go down this rabbit hole of more extreme things, because more tantalizing, sort of unbelievable things draw people into these binging sessions. But I think it's useful to understand that this is what it is. It's a YouTube recommendation system, not just an algorithm. So it is recommending content to the users. And the goal is then to create your videos with real people in mind. In fact, a great exercise that's often talked about when making YouTube videos is to envision a real person. What's their job? What do they do day to day? What's their schedule? What do they like? What don't they like? And make a video for them. Almost like if you were told to make a video for family or friends that you know, what do they like? And if you make a video for a real person, that person is presumably like other people, and you've now had an audience that you've picked. So, a little more specifically, what are some suggestions for getting started on YouTube that I've sort of picked up from my time working on it? I think first there's some questions you want to be able to answer, and that's, what's your goal? So given what we're talking about here today, it may be, I want to raise awareness about snakes in my area. The more narrow your goal, the easier it's going to be to accomplish, and the better you'll be able to sort of focus your channel. It may be, I am at a nature center and I know there's people in the area who enjoy hiking here, but for whatever reason, can't make it in when the nature center is open, or maybe they just would prefer to consume content virtually. Maybe they can't access the trails for some reason. So I want to reach them with sort of distance content. So you can have a very specific goal like that. You also then need to let that inform the niche you're going to occupy. And with wildlife stuff, it's really hard because our niche is basically sensational person handling snakes, or really intensive documentary style high quality stuff like Planet Earth. There have not been a lot of good in-betweens developed. So a lot of this is figuring out, how can I make a niche that doesn't sensationalize too much, but also is interesting and can garner an audience. You also need to know who your audience is, which, like I talked about before, it's a good exercise to envision real people for this, because the algorithm is just an in-between. There's not people making active decisions that much in who sees your content. And then really think about how much time you can commit. It may seem like a simple thing to just post a YouTube video from time to time, but if you really want to see growth and to reach a lot of people, this is a commitment and it takes work to do. For me and the 2 people I work with on Life Underfoot, we all have day jobs. We all are doing different things, often research or other stuff that takes up a lot of our time. So we end up kind of having periods of productivity and long periods of no productivity on our channel. And to some extent, that's okay, and that's just the way that it is. But if you really want to post a lot, you need to make sure you can. And then it's important to avoid some common mistakes that people often do when they approach YouTube, which is, first and foremost, just thinking, well, I can't really do that because I don't have a video camera. I don't really have any filming experience. But the reality is, if you've got one of these, you have a great video camera. Our smartphones are becoming increasingly sophisticated video cameras with good, very good video, on par with pretty expensive video cameras, and decent enough audio. But even if you don't have a really good quality video, it really, the content and the nature of what you're posting is going to matter more than the quality of your video and audio. That matters, but finding something that people are interested in matters most. And you can do that with anything that can shoot video can do that. So you can start with very cheap equipment, and you should. The first videos are going to be the probably not your best anyway, and it's good to just jump in and start working on it. Also, avoid branded intros. This is when you have a video that pops up and there's some music and maybe a title or the brand name pops up, and we're guilty of this. Most of our past videos, we have a Life Underfoot branded intro. We've stopped doing this because it's very clear that that first 15 to 30 seconds that someone is watching a YouTube video are critical for retention. If they log in wanting to see, can you believe this snake can climb so high in the tree? And they instead are seeing this musical intro with the stuff that they're not really there to see, they may click off. A lot of these decisions are made very quickly. So avoid branded intros. Also avoid spending all your time on the filming, trying to get all the perfect footage. It's good to get good footage, and you definitely should, and even in the editing. But as I mentioned earlier, it's really important to invest just as much, if not more time, in the planning of the content, in the scripting of what you're going to say, and in the way you're constructing your thumbnail and title. All of this goes into how people are receiving and perceiving what you're making. It's all part of your content. It's not just the video. And I think it pays to be very deliberate in how you're portraying things, especially with snakes, where there's already so many negative perceptions. It's a bit of a minefield that you don't want to reinforce. And this other one, there's the old saying in writing, which is a little, I guess, morbid, is kill your darlings. And the saying in writing at least means don't get too attached to your characters, to your ideas, to your plot twists. If it's not working, if it's not good, and you think you can improve it, completely get rid of it and do something different. And I think this definitely applies to editing in YouTube. You may have 2 minutes of footage that you really like watching of a snake doing something. Maybe it's kind of a subtle thing and you just like to look at it. But probably your average viewer doesn't want to watch 2 full minutes of that unless there's something really interesting happening. So, we may spend 2 hours filming a 5-minute video. We cut down the vast majority of all the stuff we film. And we'll travel to places to film, get a shot, and then in the end think, this doesn't fit into the message we're trying to give. We're going to cut the whole thing. And it hurts to get rid of a whole bunch of effort and hours you put into trying to get a shot. But if it's not serving your message, if it's not serving your goal, it probably shouldn't go in the video. It applies to writing and it applies to good video making as well. So I want to end my little guide on social media stuff here with just this idea of short form content, short videos. TikTok really got this ball rolling with these vertical, which are optimized for mobile devices, short 30 to 60 second typically videos. And the thing that has made these so popular is if you just think of keeping people on a platform and keeping going when people don't really have a long attention span to watch a 10-20 minute video. If it's 30 seconds, they can keep going through a lot of these, and you may be able to keep someone on a platform a lot longer with 130-second videos than however long one really long video is. So it's good at keeping people on the platform, which is why TikTok has done so well, why it's growing so fast, and it's why YouTube has done shorts, which are exactly the same thing, and both Facebook and Instagram, the whole Meta company, has done reels. And on Instagram especially, this has been incredibly controversial. It's been mostly a photographer's platform, and now the only way to grow effectively on Instagram is by posting these short videos. That's what's reaching people. And so there's a lot of negatives to this, and when you shrink down your content even more, it becomes even harder to work in nuance that you might need to work in with topics like this. But I've sort of taken it on as an interesting creative challenge. I've had a lot of fun making shorts for YouTube and TikTok and Instagram. And I think really sometimes you can focus hard on one message you want to convey. Snakes are not aggressive. I want to convey that, and I want to do it in a 60-second video. That can be an interesting challenge, and it can cut right to the point. And you can reach people much quicker on these platforms than you can on YouTube because of the sheer ease with which people can see a lot of different content. And also my experience has been that TikTok and Instagram especially are able to reach a much broader and more diverse audience than YouTube is. YouTube is very focused and niche driven. So if you just want to get started and you're okay with vertical videos filmed on your phone, I'd give this a shot. It's a great way to get good messages out there very quickly to a lot of people. We had one TikTok video on vernal pools, basically how to create a fishless pond and what kind of things might use it. Got 500,000 views in about 10 hours on TikTok. We haven't replicated that success, but we have had a few others get tens of thousands of views on TikTok. TikTok, despite putting a lot less effort into it, is now our biggest platform. So I highly recommend folks check out some of these if any of that interests you. They also can use copyrighted music through the app. You do a lot of the editing in app. So you can overlay copyrighted audio clips, and it's not legally problematic because the app itself owns the rights to that, and it's all within the app. And that may seem kind of weird or hokey even, but the cool thing about it is you can then, maybe someone has a favorite song, but they don't know anything or care anything about snakes. If you just happen to use their favorite song because you think it's appropriate for some reason, overlaying one of your short videos, they may have that show up on their feed and be like, oh, this is so cool. Like I never would have discovered this video about snakes if this song hadn't been part of it. A great example right now is because of the Stranger Things, if that's a show you watch, the Running Up That Hill by Kate Bush has been hugely sort of had a big resurgence. And a lot of people who like that song and like Stranger Things are running into content that just uses that audio and probably getting to see a lot of things they wouldn't otherwise get to see because of it. And really, this short form video is the quickest way to grow. It's also the quickest growing kind of visual content. It's kind of taken everything over for better or worse. So to wrap up kind of my part of this, I've talked a lot about messaging that I think is harmful, and I've talked a lot about how to use tools within these social media platforms. But I also want to say we need innovative messaging. We need people to come to this that aren't just person with animal, talk about animal, put animal down and walk away. That's been kind of the traditional wildlife host of a video sort of approach. We need to think of this in different and innovative ways. And a couple of things we've tried to varying levels of success. We've tried to sort of play with ideas of perspective. So, we put a phone under a log so that you could actually see what it looked like from a salamander's perspective as their world was lifted off over their head. That was kind of to introduce this looking for salamanders, but we wanted to hammer home that this is not harmless and it's stressful to the animals. So the wonder of finding a salamander juxtaposed alongside the stress it does to this animal, which is very much a real living, feeling, thinking being. These are complex things that we want to introduce. Also, you can have spectacular footage. You can have sensational footage that's not sensationalized. And a great thing we've been able to do is because Zach does so much underwater footage and films so much underwater, you can see things that people don't normally get to see from a perspective that they don't normally get to see. So seeing a big breeding congregation of spotted salamanders underwater in a vernal pool is spectacular, but it's not sensationalized. It's just in and of itself spectacular. And finally, I think each individual wild animal has an interesting story to tell. And if you've ever been involved in a study where you get to follow around animals and track them or monitor them over time, or if you live in a place where you see the same wild animals over and over, you start to see this. And I think there are ways that people who want to make videos can tell the stories of these individuals using innovative techniques. So I want to see what people can do. I want to see more diverse approaches to making videos on these platforms. And my goal here is just to hopefully give you some tools to do it if that's something you want to do, and spark a little interest in it if it's not something you've thought about before. So with that, I was going to try to share a couple videos, but I think it's probably going to be difficult, and I'm sure I've run us a little low on time. So hopefully we have some time for questions.
All right. Thank you, Andrew. That was awesome. I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did. So if you had questions that you were kind of holding on to, now would be a good time to put it in the chat. Yeah, I feel like a little selfish because I'm like, oh, I needed to learn about all this stuff. We're just doing it for us. But But yeah, that's great. That's amazing that like one of your first like sort of dipping your toes into TikTok had 10 million, you said, in 10 hours?
No. It had 500,000. No,
Half
10,
a
not
million.
10
Okay.
million, 500,000. No, 500,000
Yeah,
something.
that's still a
It,
lot. I
yeah,
don't,
it's our biggest reach we've had on anything. And it was, I mean, to just the speed at which those very quick paced platforms grow is incredible. To watch that number of views tick up every few seconds by 2 or 3,000. I mean, it's just ridiculous to know that many people are watching a video about salamanders and frogs breeding in a pond. It's really encouraging.
Mhm.
It
Yeah,
was nice to know people cared.
yeah, it's exciting. I haven't been able to talk myself into trying with TikTok yet. But yeah.
Understandable. I completely get that.
Mm. Alrighty. So, oh, we do have a question in the
Good.
chat. So
Right.
thinking about, you kind of talked about like not spending all your time on filming and editing and thinking about some of the other things. So for those super short TikTok videos, because that is
Mhm.
such a tiny piece, like, yeah, what
Yeah,
is the average time it takes you to produce one?
that's a good question. So I would say to film it, it doesn't take very long. It might take me 20, 30 minutes to film a TikTok. To edit it, it probably takes me an hour or two to edit it. But that's compared to like a 5 minute YouTube video, which I would say it's really variable the filming time depending on if we have to travel to multiple locations or interview anybody for people working with the species. Typically, I think if we don't have to do anything overly complex, we can film a YouTube video that's 5 minutes in 2 or 3 hours maybe on one day. But editing that can take 5 to 10 hours or more. I mean, it doesn't have to. You maybe complicate it more than it does, but if you really get down and really get micromanaging with editing, which we tend to do, then it takes hours. It's the ratio of minutes in the video to hours spent editing it is pretty staggering sometimes.
Yeah, same.
Yeah, I bet. I bet.
Says the person had asked that doesn't do most of our editing. That is Jeff, and it's definitely hours and hours. The filming too, but yeah, the editing is there's so many things that are possible to tweak, and you kind of, that perfection, like missing the good while seeking the perfection. I forget exactly what that saying is, but it's real easy to do with editing videos.
Yeah, yeah. It's
um
you can really get hung up on it.
Yeah. So I had mentioned this to you before we got started with the live presentation today. Someone submitted a question to us in advance. And we had a neat discussion on this. And I think for people coming to this who don't and maybe aren't interested in hopping on YouTube or TikTok right now and starting their own channel, but thinking about how we can apply the stuff that you've talked about and learned to just like all the other ways that we reach people. So Jen Alvarez asked, what can she do as a regular person to help others overcome their irrational fear of snakes? And so since you've already talked about how you can use video content to do that. So maybe, obviously not all the ways, because that's a whole class, but yeah, just kind of how you can apply sort of the themes that you talked about in the video content when you're like face to face with somebody.
Yeah, no, that's a good question, and I think given the question, I'm going to assume we're also not talking about folks that are, say, working at like a big national park where tons of people come in every day. These are people who maybe aren't professionally working with outreach and education of snakes and don't have a big interest in doing social media. And I think in that regards, and this is what we were talking about earlier, is I think you have to consider that when you're talking about trying to do a little outreach to change someone's mind on a deeply held misconception, there it seems like you really can't reach people that are not receptive to listening to you because you are not in their circle of trusted people. So I think that the biggest thing you can do, that everybody can do in terms of misconceptions of snakes, is seek to affect the people that are closest to you and that you have the ear of, because you are the person that is probably going to be able to reach them better than anybody else. So I think we often get hung up on the scale of things, and I'm guilty of it. This whole social media thing is much about scale. You can reach millions of people. But I think it is very important to consider the level of impact you can have, and nothing beats the impact you can have with close friends and family. And if you can sit down and have a conversation with someone that knows you, likes you, and trusts you, they really will, listen to you more than they will other people, even if it's about something maybe they are not wanting to believe or disagree with. So I think in that regards, my advice when you approach those kind of conversations, whether it's with friends or family or just a random person, nature center or wherever, is first consider that most misconceptions of snakes and negative attitudes come from a place of fear. And so there's a vulnerability there to having a fear. Most people don't want to admit it's fear. They'll just say, oh, I just hate them. I'm not scared. I just hate them. But it's fear by and large. And that is a very real thing. You have to respect it, that they feel stressed by this animal, and that matters, and they actually feel that. It's the place you have to start from. And then from there, I think, unfortunately, sometimes it's worth swallowing a little bit of your reaction as someone who loves snakes. When I worked at a nature center, I would have so many people come in and I would say, oh, I'm a snake guy. I like snakes. And so they say, oh, I killed 3 last week. Let me tell you how I did it. And they didn't mean anything malicious with it, but that's just what their experience with snakes were. They could not conceive of my mindset that I liked them. They did not see them like a dog or a cat or something that they might like. And so I had to kind of shrug off that initial reaction to, oh, you're terrible, you're a killer. And instead approach say, well, I can understand why that would be a reaction, but I think they're pretty cool, and let me tell you why. So I guess a little humility and a little recognition that people who hate snakes are really coming from a place of vulnerability and fear. And that if you can respect that and introduce the idea that snakes are pretty interesting and cool, I think a nice thing is that what my experience has been that often the fear of snakes and the dislike of snakes is not tied to the same things that a lot of other environmental issues are, like politics and worldview. So you can sometimes disentangle snakes specifically as something worth caring about from other things that are harder to bypass in terms of just differences in worldviews. And so if you can get past the reaction to maybe how they're going to talk about killing snakes or how much they hate them, you can just talk about how interesting they are and your experience with them. And honestly, I think that can make a big difference. If you have a pet snake and you want to show it to them and they're open to that, I think nothing beats in-person contact with a snake to see, oh, this thing actually isn't that scary, if they're at a place where they can actually approach it. So yeah, I guess that would be my advice: is gentle, calm. Don't be concerned about the facts you need to deliver. Facts are not usually the issue here. It's perception, it's emotions. There's nothing you're going to be able to do to fact your way into someone liking snakes in most instances. Biggest thing is don't give out any bad facts. So my advice is always, if you don't know, don't say anything with this. It's better to give out good feelings and vibes than to give good facts. So yeah, I guess that's my general advice from my in-person interpretation that I've done.
Yeah, agreed. That's really useful. I think a lot of that, it echoes advice I've heard about how to talk to people about just about anything. And I hadn't really considered before, but I think you're totally right that the issue of snakes isn't divisive in the same way that a lot of environmental or conservation issues are. Unfortunately, because I think it's just most people don't like them, period, regardless of their politics. But still, that puts it, it puts us all, or everyone else, in the same place. And so that does give us an advantage in talking to people, that there's no assumptions about being a tree hugging hippie necessarily just because you're into snakes. Maybe a tattooed weirdo is maybe more.
I had a great conversation with a landowner when I was doing the rattlesnake research, who went on about how he used to kill timber rattlesnakes in a different state and was not real receptive. I mean, he was taking us out in a 4-wheel vehicle to track a snake that had gone on his property. So at the beginning of this, he was being pretty generous with us in that. But he would go on and on about how much he hated the DNR, how they were wrong about all kinds of stuff with deer. And I didn't fight him on it because I didn't need to. I just said, oh, it's not really my area. I don't know. I've worked with some nice folks there, but I don't know everybody, just kind of that thing to sort of push that aside and focus on, snakes though. Snakes, I know. Snakes are good. Let me tell you why. And then we'd go out and track the snake, and he would walk out there and we'd look at the snake, and he'd kind of be back at first. And I don't know why you like that. And by the end of this, over weeks of doing this, he started bringing the rest of his family out, and he became the interpreter. He would walk out there and he'd say, this snake, did you know it stays here and it tends to have this kind of range? This snake's probably been here for years, and blah, 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 blah. And then at the end, he made a statement, something along the lines, I don't think I'll ever kill another one of these snakes again. So you can change people with deeply held views, but it is less of a fight and more of a gentle sort of let your own passion for it be a little contagious.
Yeah. totally. Awesome. So this is a more technical question that came in through the chat from Seal Klinger. Hi, Seal.
Yeah.
Do federal land management agencies have gentler requirements for permits for TikTok videos than for old-fashioned video equipment, which is, wow, not something I had considered. So that's an interesting question.
That's a very good question, and probably one I should have thought about more. But my perception is that the landscape has changed so much that I'm guessing it's now very difficult to prosecute people, and it's probably a gray area. There are tons of people who are posting TikToks and shorts and even YouTube videos, not even short ones, from public lands, no permits, no requests. I mean, with the amount of these that are coming out, not all of these people are doing that. And I'm guessing most of them are not getting prosecuted for any of it. So my guess is that probably by the time you reach the point where you are making money from it and you have a large platform, you may get scrutinized enough where if there are laws in place for that, you need to get permits. But your average person posting videos is doing it on public and private lands both, and to my knowledge, not being prosecuted for it. We've filmed on public lands without me particularly thinking about this. We don't tend to talk about the public land because I don't like to give out localities. And we've never had problems. I've talked to people about the filming and no one's ever mentioned anything. So I will say I've not really done much on federal lands. I did film recently in a wildlife refuge in Indiana, but I used to work there and I know the people there, but it didn't sound like there was any big permitting we had to go through for that. So yeah, I don't know. I guess the answer is I don't know, but my guess is a lot of this may have to do with money. And for filming movies and filming TV shows, there's a lot of money that goes to people. It's a monetary business, and these social media platforms have to reach a certain level before they really become a money-making business. But that's a very good question, and it's one I'm going to look into more after this.
Yeah, it is not something I had thought about for a while. I know when we started doing filming like 10 years ago with 12 years ago now, using the time-lapse cameras, and we pretty much only exclusively work on federal public land that, yes, again, in our videos, that is not publicized where and what for the same reasons, protecting the location. But initially when we started that work, we did, talk to the Forest Service because they were forest. And at the time, at least from a research perspective and acknowledging that cameras were one of our tools, they were only concerned about if you're disturbing the land. But I think maybe that is the difference, is the money thing, when it was for research. And we do have something in one of our state wildlife permits that was, I think it was explicitly photography, because this, again, it was like pre-cameras everywhere, that we couldn't sell photos, like they couldn't be commercial. So yeah, I'm curious because it's changed. And I know that there's been some efforts in Arizona to change permitting with how you can use things like trail cameras and game cameras just in general, and trying to make that like a form of take. And so requiring permits. And so, yeah, I'm wondering if the federal land management agencies will also start adding stuff. But yeah, I'm guessing, like you said, a gray area, and just they're so much slower to change than technology is, because YouTube was around 12 years ago, but not in the same way that it is now, and the others almost weren't. Instagram and TikTok weren't at all. So yeah, it's a good question.
And there's an interesting thing I just thought of there is, there's a lot of conversations as rates of hunting and fishing decline, and that's how a lot of conservation is funded. A lot of conversations around how do we fund conservation going into the future with take-based use. Maybe a permit to film for social media on public lands is one venue for getting some kind of income stream. And you don't really want to gatekeep being able to do that. But if you could make it inexpensive enough, maybe it wouldn't be as big of a barrier. So I don't know. It's an interesting issue.
Yeah, it is a good question.
Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well, I don't see any other questions in the chat at the moment, and we are over the hour mark. So I guess we should probably think about wrapping it up to be, polite with everyone's time. Seal says, thank you for answering her question. And so, yeah, I just wanted to thank everybody for coming to Snakes Are Everything today. And just so if you're watching the recording of this and not the live presentation, like, just so you know, we'll continue monitoring the comments for any questions that come in later, and I'll get those to Andrew. So if there are questions specifically for him, not for us, he'll be able to, I assume, get back to him. And we'll also add some links later to some of the things we've been talking about, like especially his YouTube channel. So again, if you're watching this later, you can check that out. Thank you so much, Andrew, for joining us today. This was a really interesting talk.
It was my pleasure.
Thanks to everyone who tuned in, and advocates for snake preservation supporters that make this and everything else we do possible. So snakes still have a lot to teach us. So I hope you'll join us for the next episode of Snakes Are Everything. Take care, and thank you for everything you do for snakes every day. Bye.